So good morning, or maybe even good afternoon to a few of you that are joining us from different parts of the world today. So yes, welcome to this webinar. For those of you that don't know me, I am Dan Hodgson. I'm the Lighting Applications Director for AC/DC. So let's focus on this one. Let's look at the content that we're going to look at today. We're looking at the where, the what, the how, and the why in terms of architectural lighting. Where is it used? How do we use architectural facade lighting? What does it give to a place, to a space? What are those key design fundamentals? And by that, I just mean, before we're even putting pen to paper, we're meeting our clients. What should we be thinking about? How do we take this forwards? We'll cover a little bit in terms of how lighting has evolved and how it is evolving. We all know this lighting industry is just changing so quickly right now, as is technology. So we'll just briefly go through that because I think that provides us with new opportunities as to how and why we apply light. We'll go through how do we choose the right luminaire. That might seem a little bit basic, may just seem a bit, well, really, but so much of light, in terms of that balance of science and art, but it's also about how we it's about that balance of luminaire and architecture and how we integrate it into the architecture. That's a critical thing. And then we finish up with that last section where we'll look at case studies, we'll look at examples of how can we apply light. What are those methods? How do we mix it up? How do we use those layers of light to create the right and the desired lit effects? So let's start with the where. Facade lighting, we use that within a plaza. But why? It defines the vertical. It defines the perimeter of our view. Within hospitality lighting, it allows us in the hours of darkness to begin the experience before we even arrive. The lighting helps to define the brand, and it sets our expectations, our mood. For a public building, whether old or new, a focused lighting solution brings that building to life. It enables local people and tourists to respect the past, for it to have this status in the hours of darkness. In residential, whether it's a large house in the country to an 80-meter residential tower in a city centre, the lighting can capture the architectural detail, the scale, the context. Architectural lighting for an office building, commercial and surrounding space, it helps to create escapism, to create personal and private space. It is about those layers and how we define that space with light. And even in educational buildings, yes, there is a balance in terms of that functional levels of light, but it shows that people care about the building. It creates a welcome in terms of coming into the building. And it's about that combination of architectural with public realm lighting as well. For a stadium, light defines that iconic status. They become the visual signature of the club, of the community, the fan, and it establishes this building at the center of the community. And finally, within retail, whether it's a collection of shops or a retail mall, architectural lighting defines our destination. It raises our eye line up and it allows us to take that full view in. So by lighting a building, we allow it to be seen in a very different way to how we view it, to how we view a building in the daytime. During the day, the building is lit from above, and it's lit by a clouded sky, or maybe with direct sun that's creating really strong shadows and contrasts. And that can help in terms of that timepiece with shadows created by the sun defining the time of day. By lighting in the evening, we often look at lighting the building in a very opposite way, maybe from the ground up, and we're integrating it into the architecture. We're providing maybe a close grays of light, creating great contrast, and that play of light reveals texture that maybe isn't normally seen. By combining different beam angles that allow different features to be brought out. So it's about using light to reveal the character, to reveal the scale of a building in the hours of darkness. That character, that identity of what it is and its role within the community. So let's now just look at those design fundamentals. We're starting a project. What should we think about? What's really important? So we've got the top 6 here. You may have some others, but let's just focus on these 6. So we've got context. Where is the project, first of all? What's to the left, what's to the right, what's above, maybe also what's below. If you're lighting a bridge, let's look at what's below as well. Color, it's not just about the light. Think about the materials too. When we look at contrast, is it high contrast? Are we mounting to a building, or is it more of a uniform lit effect? Control. It's not just about it being dynamic and going from red, green, blue, amber, white, whatever. It's about controlling the light. It's about light pollution and focusing the light upon the building and not the night sky. Global. This is about making sure we're specifying the right product for its location. And maybe most importantly, people. Putting them at the center of our designs, internally and externally. How do people interact with our designs? How do we make it work for them? So let's start to break this down and just kind of go through it one by one. So at the beginning of any project, whether it's for an existing building or new, it's essential that we understand where it's located. Where is it in the world? What's around it? And what are those elements that may be already lit? So here we've got two generic sections that I've drawn. The top one is a journey from the right-hand side. You can see maybe a section of a transport, whether it's train, and then we go along, we go over a bridge, maybe some retail, hospitality, transitional public realm space up to a stadium. And the bottom one is more of maybe a large townscape by the riverside. So you've got cafes, bars on the left, coming into retail, resi, to a historic building, cathedral, modern hotel, maybe into a park and monument. So really the point of this is that we start to look at two layers of light. We've got functional and we've got architectural. Yes, there are many other layers of light and we can break this down, but for the time being, let's just focus on two. And really my point here is that it's about balance. It's about that we're not competing together, and that, yes, in a dream world, we may be working on a master plan for these sort of areas. It's rare, but it happens. So really my point is that when we're focusing on a project, that we should have an understanding of what's to the left, what's to the right, and what's going on. So let's just kind of look at this. When we start to look at functional levels of light, you can see the functional levels of light here between the buildings, providing a level of light that may and probably should meet the level of light for the region that you're working in. But also consider that there are buildings that we can maybe use. So can we mount luminaires to the building that can help to both provide architectural light, but also provide lighting to the horizontal plane as well? And then we're starting to free up the space. Maybe we're not using the poles, but we're using the poles to create an identity in other areas. So thinking about how we're creating that functional level of light. So now let's just move on to architectural. We're capturing the vertical, maybe the structures, maybe historic elements, whether it's facades, maybe historic buildings, maybe it's a stadium. My point here is that when you look at the railway station on the right-hand side, maybe picking out the facade, the structure, we're picking out the bridge and working all the way along to the stadium facades, we're picking out points, we're creating nodes within that environment. When we think about the journey from one area to another, we're picking out that journey. And it's the same on the bottom section as well. The way that we're applying light, it's about creating points of contact. And really when we start to build these layers up together, and we start to think about how we're applying light, and as we bring them together, here you can see the need for a full and balanced approach to the planning and the application of lights and luminaires. There's so many variables within a project that we must be aware of. And really my point here is exactly that not one solution fits all, but just there are a lot of variables, and really have an understanding of where your project is and how you're thinking of applying light. Don't compete. When we think about context, it's important that we consider the viewpoints of the building. Those sections, we're talking about that viewpoint from the railway station to the stadium, or from the town, from the cathedral through to the hotel. And we should consider the viewpoints. They're really, really important. So here, you've got this beautiful hotel that has that reflection in the water in comparison to highly dense populated city centre. It's having an understanding of how we're going to come across these buildings. What's our journey? What's our viewpoint? And really understanding about how we're going to apply light within these areas. We must consider the foreground and the background. When we think about those sections, and we start to think about these images here, It's about really considering how we're defining our view in terms of the architectural lighting and how that is in balance with the landscape in front. We'll talk about color a little while in terms of color of the light and color of the finishes as well, and how we can differentiate that in terms of the color of light that we're applying and the textures and the finishes. But two really great examples here. You've got King's Cross on the left-hand side with that warm brick. But it's defining that view, defining the perimeter of that space when that warm white grazing up with a slightly cooler landscape in front. So having knowledge of the view, of the foreground and the background is so essential. So let's look at color and how that then has an influence, but also materials. Color is essential, and it's not just about colored light of red, green, blue, yellow. It's essential that we consider the architecture, the color and the finish of a building, and how light and the luminaire and the lighting can be applied or integrated. It's essential. Yes, this may seem basic, but from my own experience of working on projects and maybe all the way through those initial concept discussions, one person thinks we've got single color and somebody else thinks we're doing color change. It's having that understanding from a very early point on a project and making sure that if we're applying color, why? What's it doing to it? Are we using color to provide an identity, to give it something, to give it a reason? On the left-hand side here, you've got this warm white in terms of its location, the material types, and using that single color, that warmth, to really bring out the look, the feel, the brand, the experience, using artificial light in that way. And on the right here, you've got this project in Dubai where we're using color to really raise our eye line, to create a centerpiece, to create that icon within that environment, and using color in that way. I mentioned earlier in terms of color and also materials, we need to think about materials. It's so important. So a couple of really quick examples here. On the left, you've got a glazed facade. So my main advice here would be, if you're working with glass and you're trying to backlight the glass, grab hold of a sample, understand your materials, understand the texture. If it's glass, is it clear? Is it opal? Is it diffused? How is the light going to react to your material? Do we need to offset it, and by how much? Is it reflected from a surface behind? And how do we create that consistency? Color consistency, it's all so important across all of these examples and all projects. So we'll come on to how do we select the right luminaire, but here, understand your material, understand the texture, understand the finish. And when we think about color and we think about color temperature, the second image here along on Oxford Street, using warm white, but using the reflectance and the textures and the finishes of these two buildings with the same color temperature. The texture and the finish of those facades create enough of a difference. You probably don't need a cool white in relation to the red brick on the right. And then you've got that Corten steel, the third image along. So we're picking that out with a warm white, really defining that building in the hours of darkness. And then on the right, you've got color, using color to create a space that people feel safe in, they want to be in, and to some degree, people want to go and see it. And when we think about historic buildings, yes, we can apply color. There's strong opinions as to how and if and what and why. One of the ways that we can do it is by considering dynamic white. So by using dynamic white, we can get the right white, we can get the right color to really define that building, to really bring out that color, that texture, that form, that scale of that building. So think about those warm whites, maybe think about dynamic whites. In dynamic white, we can do that in terms of setting scenes of light that evolve over a period of time as well. So dynamic white is obviously a key consideration. Now, if we're using color, people have strong opinions on colored light. And particularly here, this is a public building, a tower over in Belgrade. So this color represents, it defines this building in the hours of darkness. But we have to be careful with color. We have to use it for a reason, use it to create an identity, use it to represent an occasion, an activity maybe. So not always just because we can, but use it for good reason. You know, when we think about stadiums like this and Tottenham Hotspur, and using that colour to define the brand, to define the experience, but also, you know, being careful as to how we're applying it, that it's focused onto the architecture, that we're grazing across the facade, that we're not pouring light into the night sky. So colour, and just being really careful as to how we use it. So let's now focus on this third section of contrast. And really this is about that play of light and shadow, but also it's about where we're going to be installing the luminaires in terms of defining that level of contrast. So let's just think about that, and let's just think about what is the lit effect we're trying to achieve. So on the left-hand side, building mount, lower output luminaires, picking out the architecture between the windows, so high contrast. In the middle here, we have that linear graze on each level, grazing up each level and picking out the architectural detail. Or do we go to the right, where you're bathing that facade in a uniform level of light? What do we want? What are we trying to achieve? And just really thinking about what is the lit effect that we're trying to achieve. And it really is about a balance of color and intensity. You know, what do we want to do? Where do we want to place the focus of our project? So it goes back to how we started in terms of that view, that journey, and when we come onto it, people and how they experience and interact with this space. So that balance of color and intensity. So now let's just focus on control. So control is not just about changing from red to green to blue to white and that sort of thing. You know, is it also about thinking about how we're controlling the light? How we're making sure that the scheme that we're designing, that we're putting forward, is we're not lighting the night sky, and that what we're doing is we're lighting the architecture, we're lighting the structure with a focused source. We're using the right output, we're using the right optic, so that we're defining that building. So one way of doing this, obviously, if the building is existing, if you've got access, is considering a mock-up. You know, mock-up is usually done of one section of the design, but it's a really good way of getting all parties that have an invested interest in that final scheme. They can attend, they can be there to help sign it off. And yes, manufacturers like us are obviously more than keen to help and kind of move that project forward with you. But it should be, you know, it's about looking at the position of the luminaires, it's about coordination, you know, but it's also thinking about accessories. You know, do we need to think about a louver, a cowl, a snoot to help us focus the light upon the vertical, and that the soffit of the buildings that we're framing, but also limiting the view into the light source and thinking about the positioning of the luminaires. So in terms of mock-ups, you know, they are essential, but it doesn't have to be on that final building. You know, I would also highly recommend grabbing hold of a fitting and just putting it, you know, in your office, grazing it against the wall, looking at it in terms of grazing across the floor and looking at the color consistency of the beam, the shape of the beam, and really understanding the quality of the lit effect, of the color, of the consistency, and of the output and the intensity of the light. So just think about those sort of things and just playing with light and really having an understanding. You know, when we think about control and we start to consider whether we do want to have scenes of light. So this is a really great example where this is this glass cube. It's a community space in the center of this central plaza. And you might be thinking, oh, I hate color. It's just like, yeah, you know, I can completely understand that view. But, you know, I appreciate this just for this video, but they use color, static color, to represent certain activities. And then when there's a youth club inside this, then, you know, they use color and dynamic light to represent the activity that's going on inside. But they're using light in a clever way. So yes, it's all about the architectural detailing, and we'll come on to how that is achieved. But it's smooth, it's consistent, that control of the light. It's about coordination, and it's about a multidisciplinary approach between different parties to really get that architectural detailing, to get that control, to get that dynamic lit effect. You know, I can't recommend highly enough that we also consider throughout our designs that we look to and we focus on not pouring light into the night sky. This is about optic control, it's about output, it's about the right luminaire type. You know, and there's loads of text and advice and information from different parties, the ILP and others, in terms of light intrusion and making sure that what we're doing is best practice. So, I would recommend that, and I'm more than happy to help where and if I can. So this might seem like a strange one as we move on to global application, but when you're working on a project, it might seem an odd thing to say, but you need to be really, really aware of obviously where your project is. If you're fortunate enough to work on projects in other countries and you need to travel, then I just want to point out a couple of things in terms of making sure that the products that we're speccing are suitable for their location and really having an understanding of context. Yes, this is about context in terms of what's to the left, to the right, but it's also about thinking about where is your project and really understanding about what do you need to consider, how are people going to interact with your project, and trying to think about the what ifs. So ambient temperature, -20 to +50, is it wider than that? What do we need to be considering in terms of weather, in terms of seasons, of dirt, of dust, of leaves, of sand, storms, irrigation, water, that sort of thing. And really my point here is about thinking about the finish of the luminaire. Just think about longevity. You can finish a scheme, it's locked off, it's finished, the scenes look amazing. First couple of weeks, first few months, it looks amazing. You look incredible. Sorry, the scheme looks incredible. Yeah, okay, your portfolio looks, it's incredible. The building looks superb. People are so proud. You also want your scheme to continue that way, that you look back on it years after years and go, wow. And it's about just thinking about these things, about the drive over and the walk over. If it's a plaza, what sort of vehicles are driving around that plaza over those fittings? Is it just people walking over? Do we need to think about genie lifts, about fire engines driving over in-ground fittings? So it's just thinking about who's using it, where they're using it, and to some degree exceptions as well. And when we think about exceptions, whether we like it or not, let's just think about criminal damage. And that's having an understanding of what's going on in your area, and just making sure that the fittings we're speccing are suitable for their location. Might seem simple, and to some degree it is, but it's really important, as is our people. So, light and lighting is that balance of art and science, and people are at the center of that as to how they interact with light. And when we think about those things we've talked about so far in terms of control, in terms of color, this is about making sure that we're lighting architecture, that we're lighting objects, and that we're not causing discomfort, glare, and we're not causing people to have a bad time. That sounds so simple, but it really is about emphasizing our architecture and bringing it to life in the hours of darkness. It's not about causing glare or discomfort to people's lives. We need to think about people externally and internally, whether it's residential, whether it's a hotel, whether it's the public realm. It's about showing these spaces and really lighting them sympathetically. We want to really show these buildings so they look incredible within the urban landscape. But it is about the control. It is about making sure that we focus the light where it needs to be, that we're not causing glare. Whether it's someone inside the building looking out, that they're not going to get a face full of glare in their face when they look out, but likewise the other way as well. That, if we're thinking about uplights, when we're thinking about how people are interacting with the urban space, how are they interacting with it? How are they going to interact with your scheme? How can we control it? Is it through lenses? Is it through accessories, louvers? Can we tilt the light source so that we're focusing it upon the vertical? Can we use lenses to make sure that we're doing it? And it is a balance, so think about how people are interacting with your scheme. So let's just briefly just think about how lighting and technology has evolved hugely over the last 20 plus years. It's not that long ago that we were looking at massive lamps, massive control gear, big luminaires, and it just meant that how we lit, what we lit with, the methods that we used, they were limited. It was quite often about just offsetting from a facade and going blah, and that's no disrespect. It was about what we could do at the time. And, in the lighting industry, the lighting design industry, we're really challenging and really moving this on in terms of what we can do, how we can do it, and how we can move it on. And it provides us with so many new opportunities as to how we can integrate light. it's now, when we think about new form factors, when we think about how that is moving on, we're now in a position whereby luminaires, so yes, I'm going to talk about AC/DC luminaires, so the PhenoFlex. But the point that I want to raise is that it's bendy, it's curved, it's got optics, it provides consistency in terms of lit effects, in terms of grazing. But my point here is that it's bendable, it's flexible, and we can consider light and lighting a lot earlier within a design process. We can use it to integrate into architecture a lot earlier, so we can think about it in terms of that design process. And it's not just form factors, it's technology factors as well, that we're using light in different ways as to how we can change the identity, the character of a space over one evening. So we're changing the look, the feel, and so we can use those lenses, we can use LED and new technologies in new ways to create new atmospheres, new characters within an external space. But how do we select the right type of luminaire? How do we take that forward in terms of, we understand the context, the color, we're starting to understand the space that we're lighting for, who we're lighting it for. We're starting to get a really good understanding of technology and how we're going to apply it, working really closely in terms of that multidisciplinary approach of the consultant, the architect, the lighting designer, all working together. So top 5 here in terms of how to select the right type of luminaire. So first of all, position. Where's it going? We'll come on to that in a moment. The shape of the luminaire. So my point here would be that work with the architecture. And then 3, optic. What are we picking out? How are we creating that level of contrast from what we've talked about before? 4, output. Don't overlight, but don't underlight. And it's about that balance and really understanding the light. And then, of course, control. So yes, that's about accessories. Yes, it's about maybe scenes of light as well. So let's just go through these. So I'm going to come on to these methods of light in a moment. But as we get to know our project, as we get to know how and why we're applying light, let's just think about, first of all, surface mount. We're going to mount to the building. We need to find out whether we can. Is it a historic building? Are we going to recess luminaires and come and just do that close offset graze? Are we going to have an offset flood where we're coming away from the building and providing that uniform lit effect or picking architecture out? Are we integrating or are we backlighting? So my point here is that, yes, you can see that there are different lit effects for different positions. So, and we'll come on to layering in a little while in terms of you don't just have to pick one type. We can layer this up a little bit. So just think about your position. And my point here is that when we're working on a project, when we're starting a project, just work out where you can position your luminaire. Again, it might seem really simple, but there may be restrictions, there may be limitations as to how and what and where in terms of where you can position luminaires. And to some degree, that's going to help you and guide you in terms of your luminaire shape. So if it's surface mount, is it a smaller luminaire, lower output, that single optic just picking out the detail? So we've got a little bit more contrast there. Is it recessed? We can recess in the grounds. Is it close? Is it coming further away? So then we may be starting to think about a linear fitting. Yes, we can have a spot as well. Offset floods. The likelihood here is that we're maybe talking about a slightly bigger fitting here, slightly larger outputs. So that starts to dictate the type of luminaire that we're looking at. Is it integrated? So linear lines of light or point sources, or is it backlit? Generally, we try and use a linear luminaire just so providing that consistency in terms of the lit effect. So your luminaire shape starts to work with your position, starts to work with your architectural, the architecture. I'm sorry. So let's now start to look at optic and beam shape. So what are we looking to do? Yes, there's manufacturers, we have a wide choice in terms of beam angles and that sort of thing. So my advice would be, what are you looking to light? Have you got columns that you want to pick out and maybe use a very narrow beam? And maybe if it's a curved column, are you going to light it on 2 sides just to graze it, just kind of pick it out and graze up and then pick out the architectural detail at the top? Or maybe there's a linear beam between the pillars, so you get that linear graze going up with the punch of your narrow beam on the pillars. So just look at that balance and just think about how you're balancing those contrasts in terms of the lit effect of your building. But also, just think about the luminaires that you're using. Think about where the light is going. So are you using an optic? Are you using a reflector? So when we talk about how light is evolving, how technology is evolving, just think about, I'm not going to go into details now, we're limited on time, but just think about where the light is focused in terms of your main beam angle and your field angle, and just making sure that you've got beam control, that you're putting the light where it needs to go. And yes, that's down to mock-ups, yes, it's down to modeling, and just understanding your luminaire type. And then it comes down to output, okay? So so much of this is really about grabbing hold of a fitting and putting it on the floor, putting it on the wall, and really understanding the quality of that lit effect and looking at the output. Yes, we can do measurements. Yes, we can do light levels. So much of architectural facade lighting is more about the art than the science. Yes, we can do the modeling. And really my point here is about contrasts and just understanding the layers of light between a very narrow beam and a linear graze. Just looking at that in terms of, you can look at it in terms of modeling, so many different packages that we can use, and just look at that from contrast values. Yes, you can use your light levels and just think about what's that, the peak intensity. Let's just think about your light levels at certain points, so it's not too harsh. We can go on about this section for quite some time, but I guess my main point with it here is just play with the light and really understand the quality of the light. And then, of course, when we think about control, two massive extremes here. On the left-hand side, you've got a bridge that's going loopy. I'll be honest and say this was during the testing of it. This isn't what it does all the time. And on the right, this is just about control. It's about intrigue. It's almost about what you're not lighting that shows more about this castle. It shows this deep level of contrast, of control, of intrigue. And it's just a massive contrast to your bridge on the left. And on the left, you've got a lot of luminaires. On the right, it's maybe got 8 or 9, maybe 10 fittings. The context are very different, but just think about, sometimes it's about what you don't light, and it just creates that level of contrast, that play of light, that level of intrigue. So just think about that from a control. On the left, dynamic scenes of light. On the right, switched on, off, but it's about that play of light more than anything else. So let's now look at how can we apply light. So let's look at the 6 fundamentals of architectural lighting. So this is the last section of this webinar this morning. So we can look at, and we've talked about this a little bit before, surface mount. We can look at recessed. We can look at ground mounted coming away from the facades. We can look at pole mount, and we can look at delineation and backlit. So my main point here is that this is not about you must do this, or you can do this, or you must do that. We can layer this up, okay? We can start to layer the lighting up, just so that we start to create that balance of light, of control, and of contrast. So here, 3 examples of that: close surface grays of facades, high contrast on the left-hand side, linear grays in the middle, but on multiple levels. And on the right, a continuous linear grays up each level. So 3 very different ways of how we can apply light. And here within Covent Garden, this is just an incredible example by Studio Fractal of that layering of light. Yes, it's building mount. It's about the seamless integration of light, using the architecture, using it to integrate the light so that during the day they're really not seen, but by night it brings that building to life, that seamless integration. But the other point here is that, when we think about surface mounts, we don't have to light everything, okay? And a great example here from LDI in terms of, picking out the key examples, the key facades, the key elements of a facades. And it's surface mount, picking it out, grazing up, and capturing the scale and height of a building. When we're recessed, this project here from Spears and Major, using that linear source at a low level, integrated, controlling the light, grazing up, and picking out the scale, the height, and again, it comes down to the view of the architecture, the view of this building from afar. And here on King's Cross, using surface mount and recessed alongside each other. So you've got recessed in the ground level up, picking out the facade, warm white brick, and then on the next levels, using that linear source again. So you've got that consistency. So when we think about what we talked about, context, you know, we're looking at the people, the control of the light, control of the glare. When we're thinking about color, warm white, because we're picking out that warm brick, and then we're grazing up using a linear source. So we're capturing the facade, we're capturing the height and the scale of that building. And then when we start to look at offset floods, we're coming away from the building. That might mean because, you know, we're limited in terms of mounting positions. We're limited in terms of where we can or can't mount luminaires. So offset floods. So we're coming away from the building, providing a uniform lit effect on the facades. Or is it offset, but we're still going with that punch and we're creating high contrast? Just because we're coming away from the building doesn't mean we're just going to flood it. You know, here you've got this great example of an 80-meter tower, and we've still got contrast. We're still playing with the lights. We're capturing the underside of the horizontal elements of this tower. So we're creating a really high level of contrast upon this facade. And it's by using that linear beam on the low level with linear fittings. And then on the next levels, we're using a combination of 18 and 10-degree beams. So we're capturing the underside and then allowing the periphery of the beam to then graze up the vertical elements of it. And then if we're doing a high uniformity proposal, that we're bathing it in a uniform level of light, then we're going to come away from the facade. It's a regular array position of the luminaires that we're then lighting the vertical. And it's just about looking at your beam angle, looking at the offset position. The thing I would just say about this is when we think about people, just think about shadows, okay? Can people walk in front of this? Can they interact with your lighting installation in the hours of darkness? So just think about your positioning, think about people interaction and shadowing as well. So pole mount. You might be surprised in terms of pole mount, you know, but I think it's important that we consider it, that we do look at it. So why would we use pole mount? So we can come away from the building. It's up and out the way of our eye line, so we can light the building, we can illuminate it. I would say generally it's more of a uniform lit effect, but yes, you can still get that high contrast play of light. But it does mean that your poles are in a maintainable position from an installation perspective, that sort of thing. If you're looking to use existing poles, just be really careful in terms of weight, windage, and that sort of thing. Just got to be really careful in terms of adding luminaires to an existing pole. But it can provide high contrast, as you can see on the left, where we can have that dynamic play of light, or on the right, using architecture and using those poles so they're up and out of the way of people's eye line, and we're lighting the architecture from that position. So those previous four are about applying light, and that we are either mounting to or coming away from the building, applying architectural lighting to them. These last two are about backlit and delineation. So they're about integrating light into it. So we're either backlighting glass to provide that external view of that facade. So linear luminaires grazing down from top and from bottom and then dropping off in the middle. So my point here really is about, and BDP did this incredibly well in terms of that, using a mock-up, understanding the material, thinking about the architectural detailing, and just considering where the luminaire is in relation to the glass and that lit effect. It's about the architectural detailing and working really closely with the architect. Here on this project, we talked about it earlier, linear source at the top, narrow beam coming down, and actually at the bottom, they've got a mirrored finish just to allow the light to bounce up. So it's fading off, but you're still getting that really consistent lit effect all the way through. Exterior lighting doesn't just have to be about external luminaires. We can use internal luminaires in terms of light boxes to give that building an external view in the hours of darkness. So just think about sometimes about how we're going to create that identity, that view of that building in the hours of darkness. So then let's move on to this last one, delineation. Using light, integrating light into the architecture. Is it points of light? Is it linear lines of light? Are we framing the scale, the height, and the, in terms of this facade? Is it linear sources between each glazing element? Are we framing the scale and height of a building, or is it actually defining the identity of the building? We can use linear sources to come in, outside in, and help to guide in terms of orientation and direction. So using light in terms of aiding our orientation and our direction. And so as we come to an end on this webinar, this one's been a bit longer than normal, our design fundamentals, think about context, color, contrast, control, global. Think about people. How are they going to interact with your schemes? Picking the right luminaire type. Think about your position. Where's it going? What are your limitations? Can we match the shape of the luminaire in relation to the architecture? Think about the optic. How are we picking out, how are we creating that contrast? Think about the output, that we're not overlighting, we're not pouring light into the night sky. And how are we going to control that? Are we going to put a cowl on it, a louver? Are we going to dim it down if we need to? Have an understanding of the lit effect. And how can we apply light? Think about surface mount, your recessed, your ground, your pole mount, your backlit, and your delineation. Think about your method. Think about your position. What are your limitations? What is the context? What is the color? What are you trying to do? As I say, any queries, questions, give me a shout. I'm more than happy to help. Make your way over to the website if you want any more information or you want to see any of the previous webinars. Loads of luminaires, loads of new stuff coming from AC/DC. So get a look and give us a shout if you want any more information. Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.